After 10 years of marriage and funding his restaurant dreams, my husband banned me from his flagship location's grand opening. "You'll embarrass me," he said. I watched from across the street as celebrities arrived. Then I made one phone call. To the mysterious man who owed me a favor. "I don't want you at the opening, Aaron. You'll embarrass me in front of the real guests." The words hit me like a slap across the face, but I just stood there in our kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd spent countless nights helping Steve perfect his signature dishes, where I'd celebrated his first successful pop-up, where I'd held him when the second location almost failed. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was telling me I didn't belong at his grand opening while standing in the space where his dreams had been born. I nodded. I even smiled. But something inside me cracked that night. Something that had been slowly fracturing for years. 10 years. That's how long I'd poured myself into Steve's dream like wine into a bottomless glass. 10 years of believing in a vision that apparently never included me as anything more than a stepping stone. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of quiet strength and hidden resilience. If you believe that every woman's contributions deserve recognition, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. It started so differently. Back then we were broke college sweethearts sharing ramen noodles and big dreams. Steve worked the night shift at a diner, coming home with burns on his arms and stories about difficult customers. I was juggling 2 jobs. Morning shifts at a coffee shop and evening gigs freelancing graphic design from our cramped studio apartment. We had nothing except each other and this wild idea that Steve could cook his way to something bigger. "One day we'll build something incredible together," he used to whisper on those late nights when exhaustion made everything feel impossible. "You and me, Aaron. We'll show them what real food can be." I believed him. God, how completely I believed him. When Steve's culinary school bills piled up, I took out a student loan in my name. When he needed professional-grade knives, I sold my grandmother's jewelry. When he talked about opening his first pop-up, I cashed in half of my inheritance. Money my parents had left me after the car accident. $25,000 that was supposed to be my safety net became his launch pad. "This is an investment in us," he'd said, kissing my forehead as I signed the bank papers. "Everything I build, we build together." But somewhere between his first successful pop-up and his third location, the we started disappearing. I was a graphic designer then, actually good at it. I had my own clients, my own creative world that existed beyond Steve's kitchen. I designed logos for small businesses, created marketing materials for local nonprofits, even did some work for a regional magazine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then Steve's Asian fusion concept took off, and suddenly I became the helper. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice until it was too late. First, he asked me to design his menus, just temporarily, until he could afford a real designer. Then he needed help with bookkeeping because his accountant was too expensive. When his hostess called in sick, I filled in. When his social media manager quit, I took over the Instagram account. "You're so good at this stuff," Steve would say, kissing my cheek as I worked late into the night on his promotional materials. "Why would I pay someone else when I have you?" Each time I said yes, I lost a piece of myself. My client base dwindled as I spent more time on Steve's projects. My portfolio stagnated. My identity slowly merged into his until I couldn't tell where Aaron the designer ended and Aaron the restaurant wife began. The changes in Steve started subtly, like a slow-acting poison. Success has a way of reshaping people and not always for the better. At first it was small things. He stopped asking about my day. He started using words like elevated dining experience and culinary artistry, instead of just talking about food. He began wearing expensive cologne and got his hair styled at a salon instead of letting me trim it in our bathroom. But the real shift came during industry events. Steve used to introduce me as my wife Erin, the brilliant designer who created all our visual branding. Then it became my wife Erin. Then increasingly I simply wasn't introduced at all. "You make things awkward around investors," he explained one night after a particularly uncomfortable cocktail party where I'd spent 2 hours standing alone while he networked. "They want to talk business and when you're there they feel like they have to make small talk." "I can talk business," I protested. "I've been part of this from the beginning." "You're not really in the industry though," he said with a laugh that felt like a dismissal. "It's different when it's your actual profession." The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I wasn't a chef or a restaurant owner or a food critic. I was just the woman who'd sacrificed her own career to build his. I started feeling like wallpaper at his events, always there, part of the background but never really seen. Staff members who'd worked at the restaurants for months sometimes seemed surprised to learn Steve was married. Food bloggers who interviewed him never asked about his personal life. I became invisible in plain sight. Then Grace entered our lives like a perfectly dressed tornado. She was everything I wasn't: polished, connected, professionally put together. The wife of one of Steve's major investors, she'd recently launched her own PR firm specializing in hospitality brands. She had platinum blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, wore designer clothes that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage, and spoke with the kind of confident authority that made everyone in the room lean in to listen. "Steve has incredible potential," she told me at a dinner party, her smile sharp as a knife. "But he needs the right kind of support to really break through to the next level." I should have seen it coming. The private meetings ostensibly about brand strategy. The sudden changes in how Steve dressed, talked, even held himself. The media training sessions that I wasn't invited to observe. The way he started referring to our restaurants as "my concept" instead of "our restaurants." "Grace thinks I need to be more intentional about my public image," Steve explained when I questioned the expensive new wardrobe. "She says successful restaurateurs are personalities first, chefs second." "What about what I think?" I asked. He paused, and in that pause I heard my answer. The worst part wasn't the big moments. It was the small ones. The way he'd correct my stories at dinner parties. The way he'd steer conversations away when people asked about our partnership. The way he'd grown embarrassed of our modest home, our old car, the simple life we'd built together. "You dilute his brand," Grace told me directly at a food and wine festival, her voice matter-of-fact like she was discussing the weather. "Steve needs to appeal to a certain demographic, and having a wife who looks like someone's suburban aunt, it sends the wrong message about his sophistication level." I went home and stared at myself in the mirror for an hour that night. Suburban aunt. Is that what I'd become? When had I stopped seeing myself as anything more than an extension of Steve's ambitions? But the final blow came 3 weeks ago, when Steve announced the grand opening of his flagship location. The restaurant that would cement his reputation as a serious culinary force. 5 years in the making, funded partly by my inheritance, designed using concepts I'd helped develop, staffed with people I'd interviewed and hired. "The guest list is incredibly exclusive," he said, scrolling through his phone at breakfast. "Grace has confirmed some major food influencers, a few local celebrities, and several investors who could fund our expansion." "What time should I be ready?" I asked, already mentally planning what to wear. That's when he looked up at me with something like pity in his eyes. "Actually, Aaron, I think it would be better if you stayed home for this one." The coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering against the kitchen floor. Neither of us moved to clean it up. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "Look, this is a really important night for my career. Grace has worked incredibly hard to get the right people there, and..." He paused, searching for words that would somehow make this less devastating. "You'll embarrass me in front of the real guests." The real guest. As if I wasn't real. As if 10 years of marriage and sacrifice and love and partnership weren't real enough to earn me a seat at the table I'd helped build. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. But that night, as I watched Steve practice his opening remarks in the mirror, something fundamental shifted inside me. The woman who had given up everything for someone else's dream was gone. And the woman who remained? She had some very different ideas about what came next. 3 days passed after Steve's crushing words before I picked up my phone. 3 days of moving through our house like a ghost, preparing meals he barely acknowledged, folding laundry that would hang in a closet belonging to a man who saw me as damaged goods. 3 days of staring at my reflection and wondering when I'd become someone so easily discarded. But on that 4th evening, as Steve practiced his opening speech in the living room, gesturing grandly to an imaginary crowd while I sat invisible on the couch behind him, I remembered Cooper. Cooper Henley wasn't just anyone. He was someone I'd saved, though he'd probably argue I'd saved him more than he'd ever saved me. The memory came flooding back as I watched Steve perform for his phantom audience, completely oblivious to my presence. It happened 5 years ago, back when Steve was still running Soul Kitchen. his Korean-Mexican fusion food truck that parked outside the community college on weekdays. I'd been there that Tuesday afternoon helping him prep for the lunch rush, when the health department van pulled up. Steve's face had gone white as paper. "Perfect timing," he'd muttered, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron. "Just what we need when we're behind on permit renewals." The inspector who stepped out was a tall, thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He carried himself with the careful precision of someone who took his job seriously. Clipboard clutched against his chest, pen already uncapped, expression neutral but focused. His badge read C. Henley, Environmental Health Specialist. "Good afternoon," he'd said to Steve. "Routine inspection. This shouldn't take long if everything's in order." Steve had nodded nervously, leading him toward the truck service window. I'd stayed back, organizing napkin dispensers and trying to look busy while Cooper, though I didn't know his name yet, began his methodical examination of Steve's setup. Everything had been going smoothly until Cooper opened the refrigeration unit. I watched his face change. The professional mask slipped for just a moment, replaced by something that looked like distress. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. His breathing became shallow, rapid. "Sir?" Steve had asked. "Is everything okay?" Cooper tried to respond, but the words came out strangled. He set down his clipboard with shaking hands, loosened his tie. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the October chill. I recognized the signs immediately. My college roommate had suffered from panic attacks and I'd learned to spot them from across a room. While Steve stood there looking confused and increasingly worried about his inspection, I stepped forward. "Hey," I said softly to Cooper, "you need to sit down." He looked at me with wild, unfocused eyes. I guided him to the plastic chair we kept behind the truck, away from the small crowd of curious students who'd started to gather. "What's your name?" I asked, crouching beside him. "Cooper," he managed between ragged breaths. I can't." "Cooper, listen to my voice. You're having a panic attack, but you're safe. Can you feel the chair beneath you?" I kept my tone calm, steady. "Focus on that feeling. The chair is solid. You're sitting. You're breathing." I'd pulled out my phone without him noticing, scrolling through his recent calls until I found one labeled, "Home Janet." His wife answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Henley? This is Aaron. I'm with your husband, Cooper. He's okay, but he's having some kind of episode. We're at the community college food truck area." "Yes, I'll stay with him." Cooper's breathing began to slow as I talked him through simple grounding exercises my roommate had taught me. "Count 5 things you can see. 4 things you can touch. 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. 1 thing you can taste. The students," he whispered after several minutes. "They're watching." "No one's watching anymore," I lied gently. Steve had managed to disperse the small crowd, though he kept glancing over with concern. "Just focus on getting through this." Janet arrived 20 minutes later, a petite woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair. She thanked me profusely while helping Cooper to their car, promising to take him straight to their family doctor. "I don't know how to thank you," Cooper had said before leaving, his voice still shaky but clearer. "You didn't have to do that." "Anyone would have done the same thing," I'd replied. He'd shaken his head slowly. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and walked away. You stayed. You saw me as a person, not just a problem to solve." Steve never did finish that inspection. Cooper had marked it as incomplete and promised to return the following week, which he did, with a clean bill of health for Soul Kitchen and a small potted orchid for me. "Janet grows these," he'd explained, somewhat embarrassed. "I wanted to give you something, but I wasn't sure what would be appropriate." From that day forward, Cooper and I maintained what could only be described as a gentle friendship. Nothing inappropriate or complicated, just 2 human beings who'd connected during a vulnerable moment and chose to honor that connection. Every Christmas, a card arrived in our mailbox. "Season's greetings from Cooper and Janet Henley." Always the same handwriting, always signed the same way. When I sent him a congratulations card after learning he'd been promoted to senior inspector, he'd called to thank me personally. "You probably don't remember me," he'd started. "Of course I remember you," I'd interrupted. How could I forget? The turning point in our friendship came 2 years ago when Cooper's Christmas card arrived with different handwriting. Janet's neat script had been replaced by Cooper's shakier penmanship, and the message was shorter than usual. I'd called him immediately. Janet moved out last month, he'd admitted after some gentle prodding. 28 years of marriage, and she said she couldn't handle my anxiety anymore. Said she felt like she was walking on eggshells, never knowing when I might have another episode. Without thinking, I'd driven to his apartment that weekend with a container of homemade chocolate chip cookies and a handwritten letter. The letter wasn't long, but I'd poured my heart into it. Dear Cooper, I'd written, you are so much more than your worst moments. You are kind and thorough and dedicated to keeping people safe. You saw me as a person worth helping when you came back to finish Steve's inspection, even though you could have easily failed us and moved on. Janet's leaving says nothing about your worth as a human being. You are more than this heartbreak. Much more. Your friend Aaron. He'd called me crying after reading it, not sad tears but grateful ones. You're the kindest stranger I've ever met, he'd said through the phone. Except you're not really a stranger anymore, are you? Now, watching Steve rehearse his grand opening speech while pointedly ignoring my existence, I realized Cooper might be the only person who truly understood the art of quiet revenge. I walked to the kitchen far enough away that Steve couldn't hear me and dialed Cooper's number. He answered on the third ring. Aaron, this is a surprise. Is everything okay? I stared out our kitchen window at the darkening sky and felt something settle into place inside my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but a calm certainty I hadn't experienced in years. Coop, I need a favor. The biggest one I'll ever ask. There was a pause. In the background, I could hear what sounded like a television news program. What kind of favor? So I told him everything. Not about the 10 years of marriage or the lost inheritance or the gradual disappearance of my identity. Those details wouldn't matter to him. Instead, I told him about Steve's flagship restaurant, about Grace and her real guests' comment, about being banned from an opening celebration for a business I'd helped build with my own hands and money. I didn't cry while I talked. I didn't even feel particularly sad. I just laid out the facts like ingredients in a recipe, letting Cooper understand exactly what kind of dish I was hoping to serve. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Cooper spoke. Send me the supply list for the opening menu. The vendor information too if you have it. I'll handle the rest. Cooper, I don't want you to do anything that could jeopardize your job. Aaron, he interrupted gently, I'm not going to do anything illegal or unethical. I'm just going to do my job. Thoroughly. Legally. Quietly. The way he said those words, thoroughly, legally, quietly, sent a shiver of satisfaction down my spine. That's all I need, I whispered. 2 days before Steve's grand opening, Cooper made his visit to the flagship location. Steve probably didn't even remember him from the food truck days, one inspector among dozens he'd encountered over the years. But Cooper remembered me, and more importantly, he remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person worth saving. Sometimes the most powerful favors are the ones that don't require breaking any rules at all. The gray dress had been hanging in my closet for 2 years, unworn. I'd bought it for a funeral, Steve's mentor's memorial service, but ended up wearing black instead. Tonight it felt perfect. Muted. Invisible. Exactly what I needed to blend into the evening shadows while watching my marriage's grand finale unfold across the street. I positioned myself at the small coffee shop directly opposite Convergence, Steve's flagship restaurant with its pretentious name that Grace had suggested. The cafe stayed open late on weekends, and the barista barely glanced at me when I ordered a single espresso and claimed the window table. From here I had an unobstructed view of the red carpet entrance, the gathered photographers and the steady stream of guests arriving in cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The October evening air carried the sound of orchestrated celebration across the empty street. Laughter that felt rehearsed. Conversations that sounded like performance pieces. The kind of artificial merriment that happened when everyone present was working an angle, building a network, or playing a role. Steve emerged from the restaurant's front doors at exactly 7:30, resplendent in the navy suit Grace had selected for him. Even from my distance I could see how he'd transformed himself. Posture straighter, smile wider, gestures more expansive than the man who used to practice knife techniques in our tiny apartment kitchen. He'd become the character Grace had written for him. The visionary chef, the culinary artist, the man who belonged among the city's elite. The photographers moved like a choreographed dance, capturing his descent down the restaurant's stone steps. Flash bulbs created momentary daylight, illuminating his face in artificial brightness while leaving the gathering crowd in comparative darkness. He paused at the designated spots Grace had undoubtedly marked for him, turning his head at practiced angles that would showcase his best profile. Then Grace appeared beside him and my breath caught in my throat. She wore a stunning backless emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her platinum hair swept into an elegant updo that showcased diamond earrings catching the camera flashes. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged in this world, not someone who'd married into it or worked their way up from food trucks and borrowed money, but someone born to stand in spotlights and give quotable sound bites to local entertainment reporters. From across the street I watched them work the crowd together. Grace would lean in to whisper something in Steve's ear, he'd laugh as if she'd said something brilliant, then approach the next cluster of important guests with renewed energy. They looked like a team. A power couple. The kind of partnership that graced magazine covers and society pages. I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was watching Steve with the woman he actually wanted by his side. Local celebrities, was how the food blogger had described tonight's guest list, but I recognized several faces from the city's social media accounts. The restaurant critic from the daily newspaper, the food photographer whose Instagram account had 500,000 followers, the local morning show host who did weekend dining segments. These were Steve's real guests. The people whose opinions could make or break a restaurant's reputation with a single review or social media post. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment my heart jumped, thinking Steve might have changed his mind and wanted me there after all. Instead it was a photo from my neighbor showing our cat, Muffin, asleep in a patch of evening sunlight. "Keeping me company while you're out," the text read. "Hope you're having a wonderful evening." I almost laughed at the irony. Even my neighbor assumed I was at the opening, probably dressed in my finest outfit, standing proudly beside my successful husband as he achieved his biggest dream. The reality, sitting alone in a coffee shop wearing a funeral dress, watching my marriage's death scene play out through a window, seemed too surreal to explain. Through the restaurant's tall windows, I could see the dining room filling with elegantly dressed guests. The interior design was stunning, warm lighting, exposed brick walls, carefully curated artwork that I recognized from galleries Grace had mentioned in her Instagram posts. It looked exactly like the vision boards I'd created 3 years ago when Steve first started planning this location, except refined and elevated by a professional designer whose name would actually appear in the restaurant's promotional materials. The servers moved through the space with practiced efficiency, carrying silver trays laden with Steve's signature appetizers. I could almost taste the Korean-spiced short rib sliders from here, a recipe Steve had perfected during our food truck days, now presented on bone china plates with microgreen garnishes that probably cost $5 per serving. A wave of bittersweet nostalgia washed over me as I watched guests sample the dishes I'd helped develop. Late nights in our home kitchen, Steve experimenting with flavor combinations while I offered feedback and suggestions. The excitement when he'd nail a new technique or perfect a sauce ratio. The dreams we'd shared about the day when people would pay premium prices to experience his culinary vision. Those dreams were coming true tonight, just without me in them. At 8:15, Steve moved to the restaurant's front steps and called for attention. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with the polite expectation of people who'd attended dozens of similar events. He began his prepared remarks, thanking investors for their belief in his vision, praising his amazing team for their dedication and creativity, expressing gratitude for the support of the culinary community. I waited for my name. Some acknowledgement of the decade I'd spent building this moment alongside him. Even a generic mention of my wife's unwavering support would have felt like something. It never came. Instead he spoke about his journey as if it had been a solo expedition. His vision. His sacrifice. His determination to bring authentic flavors to discerning palates. Grace stood behind him, nodding at appropriate moments, her smile perfect and professional. The applause was enthusiastic but polite, the kind of response that happened when people were still evaluating whether they wanted to be associated with what they were witnessing. This was Steve's audition for the city's culinary elite, and everyone present was deciding whether to cast him in the role he wanted to play. My coffee had grown cold, but I continued sipping it anyway, needing something to do with my hands while I watched this elaborate performance. A few more guests trickled in fashionably late, including a woman I recognized as the food editor for the city's lifestyle magazine. Someone whose review could launch a restaurant into the stratosphere or condemn it to obscurity. That's when I noticed Cooper. He'd arrived so quietly that even I, watching specifically for him, almost missed his entrance. He wore his standard health department uniform, khaki pants, light blue shirt, official badge clearly visible. He carried a clipboard, wore disposable gloves, and had a small cooler that I knew contained testing equipment and sample containers. No one paid attention to him. Health inspectors were background noise at restaurant events. Necessary bureaucracy that successful establishments barely acknowledged. He nodded politely to the hostess, showed his credentials, and disappeared into the kitchen area while the celebration continued on the dining room floor. I found myself holding my breath, though I couldn't say exactly what I was hoping for. Cooper had promised to do his job thoroughly, legally, and quietly. He hadn't promised me revenge or vindication or even justice. Just that he would inspect Steve's flagship restaurant with the same meticulous attention he brought to every establishment under his jurisdiction. The difference was that this time he had a reason to look closer than usual. Steve raised his champagne glass toward the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the street as he proclaimed, "To convergence, where exceptional ingredients meet innovative techniques to create unforgettable experiences." The guests raised their glasses in response, the golden liquid catching the restaurant's warm lighting. Cameras flashed again, capturing what was meant to be the triumphant moment that launched Steve's career into a new stratosphere. Inside the kitchen, Cooper methodically worked his way through health department protocols, checking temperatures, examining storage procedures, testing samples with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that food safety wasn't negotiable, regardless of how important the people eating it believed themselves to be. As guests lifted their forks to taste the first course of Steve's exclusive tasting menu, Cooper cleared his throat and stepped forward into the dining room. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if we'd choreographed it ourselves. The dining room fell silent in that particular way that happens when 50 people simultaneously realize something has gone terribly wrong. Cooper stood in the archway between the kitchen and dining area, his clipboard held against his chest like a shield, his expression professionally neutral despite the bomb he was about to drop. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet space, "I'm Cooper Henley with the Environmental Health Department. I need to interrupt this evening's festivities." Steve's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. Grace's perfect smile flickered for just a moment before snapping back into place, though I could see the confusion in her eyes even from across the street. The food blogger who'd been photographing her appetizer slowly lowered her phone. Cooper reached into his folder and withdrew a printed report, the official health department letterhead clearly visible even from my distant perch. "Lab results show the presence of banned preservatives in your imported caviar," he announced, his tone matter-of-fact despite the word's devastating impact. "Specifically, potassium benzoate levels that exceed FDA guidelines by a factor of 3. The collective gasp that rose from the assembled guests was audible even through the coffee shop's windows. I watched as heads turned toward each other, eyebrows raised, phones discreetly pulled from purses and pockets. The lifestyle magazine editor's fork clattered against her plate. But Cooper wasn't finished. "Additionally," he continued, consulting his clipboard with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this countless times before, "your refrigeration logs indicate irregular temperature fluctuations over the past 48 hours. Your walk-in cooler recorded temperatures of 46 degrees for a cumulative period of 6 hours yesterday afternoon. That's a significant contamination risk for your protein storage." Steve's face had progressed from its natural color to an alarming shade of red that clashed with his expensive navy suit. He stepped forward, his media training kicking in as he attempted to control the narrative. "Now hold on," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the silent room. "I'm sure this is just some kind of technical misunderstanding. These things happen in the restaurant business, right? A little paperwork mix-up, maybe some calibration issues with the thermometers." But no one was laughing with him. The morning show host had already pushed her plate away from her. The Instagram influencer was filming everything, her phone held discreetly at table level while she whispered commentary for her stories. Cooper remained unmoved by Steve's attempted charm offensive. "Sir, food safety isn't a technicality. These violations pose genuine health risks to your patrons." He reached into his folder again and withdrew a formal notice printed on official health department letterhead. I'm issuing a temporary suspension of your food service license pending a complete reinspection and remediation of these issues. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Grace stepped forward, her PR instincts finally kicking into gear. I'm sure we can work something out, she said, her voice maintaining its polished tone despite the crisis unfolding around her. Perhaps we could discuss this privately? Away from the guests. Cooper's expression didn't change. Ma'am, when public health is at risk, there's nothing to discuss privately. The notice is effective immediately. Steve tried one more desperate gambit. Look, Cooper, can I call you Cooper? We've got some very important people here tonight. Food critics, investors, media. Surely we can handle this after the event? I promise you, first thing Monday morning. Mr. Patterson, Cooper interrupted, using Steve's last name with the kind of formal distance that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. I don't care if the president himself is sitting at table 12. When I find food safety violations this serious, service stops immediately. The camera flashes started then, not the celebratory documentation Grace had orchestrated, but the harsh, urgent clicking of journalists sensing a story. The food blogger was typing furiously on her phone. Someone near the back of the room was already making quiet phone calls, presumably to editors or producers who would want to know about this development. I watched Steve's face cycle through emotions like a broken slot machine. Confusion, anger, humiliation, desperation. This was supposed to be his coronation, the night that established him as a serious player in the city's culinary scene. Instead, it was becoming a public execution of his reputation. I think there's been some kind of mistake, Steve said, his voice rising slightly as panic began to override his media training. We source everything from premium suppliers. Our caviar comes from a renowned European distributor. There's no way. The lab results are conclusive, Cooper said, holding up the report again. Your European distributor appears to be using preservatives that are legal in some countries but banned for import here. It's more common than you might think with luxury ingredients. Grace was frantically typing on her phone, probably trying to figure out how to spin this disaster into something manageable. But around the room I could see the guests making their own calculations. The lifestyle magazine editor had already stood up, her purse in hand. The local celebrity couple was whispering urgently to each other. That's when the exodus began. You know what, said the morning show host, her voice carrying clearly through the room. I'm not risking my stomach for an Instagram post. I've got a show to tape tomorrow. Her declaration seemed to break whatever spell had been keeping the other guests frozen in place. Chairs began scraping against the floor as people stood. Napkins were dropped onto plates. The quiet murmur of polite excuses filled the air. Can't believe I skipped Nobu for this, I heard one man mutter to his companion as they headed toward the exit. Steve stood in the middle of the emptying room like a captain watching his ship sink, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. Grace was still on her phone, probably trying to call in favors or work damage control, but even she seemed to understand that this particular fire was beyond extinguishing. The restaurant staff looked on helplessly as their grand opening transformed into a public relations nightmare. Servers stood with untouched plates in their hands, unsure whether to continue serving or start clearing tables. The sommelier had stopped mid-pour, a bottle of expensive wine frozen over an abandoned glass. Cooper methodically posted the health department notice on the front window where everyone could see it, a bright yellow paper that might as well have been a scarlet letter. The photographers captured that moment too, the official seal clearly visible in their shots. Within 20 minutes, the restaurant was nearly empty except for staff, a few stragglers who seemed unsure whether they were allowed to leave, and Steve standing in the wreckage of his dreams. By the time I finished my cold coffee and walked home, the story was already appearing on social media. Flagship launch shut down for food safety violation, topped the food blogger's Instagram. Caviar catastrophe at celebrity chef's debut, was the headline on the morning show's website. I didn't need to share the story myself. Everyone else was doing it for me. My phone started ringing at 11:30 that night, Steve's ringtone cutting through the silence of our house. I was in the bathtub by then, a glass of wine balanced on the edge of the tub, watching the local news replay footage of the evening's disaster. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came 5 minutes later. Then a third. Each time I simply reached over and declined the call, watching my phone screen light up with his name before going dark again. The 11 o'clock news led with the story. A highly anticipated restaurant opening turned into a food safety nightmare tonight, the anchor said, while video footage of Cooper posting the health department notice played behind her. Sources say a tip to health officials led to the surprise inspection that shut down the event. I smiled at that detail. The mystery tip-off that had led to Cooper's perfectly timed inspection. It wasn't technically true, but it made for a better story than the reality of an old friendship and a favor quietly called in. I poured myself another glass of wine and sank deeper into the warm water, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged, exactly when I needed to be there. Even if that place was alone in my bathtub, watching my husband's dreams crumble on the evening news. The phone call started at 6:30 Friday morning, less than 48 hours after Cooper's yellow notice had been posted on Convergence's front window. I was making coffee when Steve's phone rang for the 8th time in 10 minutes, each call lasting exactly long enough for someone to deliver bad news before hanging up. Marcus Steinberg just pulled his investment, Steve said after ending the latest call, his voice hollow as he stared at his phone screen. $200,000. Gone. I poured my coffee slowly, saying nothing. Marcus had been one of Steve's earliest believers, a local businessman who'd seen potential in the food truck concept and helped fund the first brick-and-mortar location. His withdrawal wasn't just financial. It was a vote of no confidence that would ripple through the investor community. He's not the only one, Steve continued, scrolling through his missed calls. Jennifer Chen wants a refund on her entire stake. Says her husband's law firm can't be associated with food safety violations. And David Morrison. He paused, his face growing paler. David's threatening to sue for false representation. Claims I misled him about our supplier relationships. I watched Steve's empire begin its collapse with the detached fascination of someone observing a controlled demolition. Each phone call was another explosive charge, carefully placed to bring down the structure he'd built on borrowed money and inflated promises. Grace's damage control efforts, which had begun with frantic phone calls the night of the shutdown, were proving ineffective. Her carefully cultivated media connections weren't returning her calls. The lifestyle magazine that had planned a feature spread on Convergence suddenly had space constraints. The Food Network producer who'd expressed interest in a potential show about Steve's rise from food trucks to fine dining went radio silent. No one wants to touch us right now, Grace admitted during a tense phone conversation that I couldn't help but overhear. The story has too much traction. Every food blog in the city is covering it. My other clients are starting to ask questions about their association with the firm. By Tuesday, the staff exodus had begun. Marcus Rodriguez, the head chef Steve had poached from a respected downtown establishment, submitted his resignation via email at 7 in the morning. His message was professionally worded but devastating in its implications. Given recent developments and concerns about food safety protocols, I feel it's in my best interest to seek opportunities elsewhere. Marcus had been Steve's crown jewel, a classically trained chef with impeccable credentials and a following among serious food enthusiasts. His departure sent a clear signal to the culinary community that Convergence's problems ran deeper than a single health department citation. The sous chef, Carmen Torres, followed Marcus out the door, but not before making sure the industry knew exactly why she was leaving. Screenshots of text messages began circulating on social media, showing Steve dismissing supplier warnings about the European caviar distributor. "Boss says the European stuff is fine," read one message Carmen had shared in a private chef group on Facebook. "Higher profit margins, he says. Customers won't know the difference." Another screenshot showed Steve's response to Carmen's concerns about the walk-in cooler's temperature fluctuations. "It's fine. Just adjust the logs if anyone asks. These health inspectors don't know restaurant operations like we do." The messages painted a picture of a chef more concerned with profit margins than food safety, someone willing to cut corners to impress investors and maximize returns. The culinary community, which valued reputation above almost everything else, began distancing itself from Steve with ruthless efficiency. Within a week, 3 more kitchen staff members had quit, followed by 2 servers and the sommelier. Each departure was another crack in the foundation, another signal that working at Convergence had become a liability rather than a career asset. Steve's response to the mounting crisis was perhaps the most damaging decision he could have made. Instead of accepting responsibility and working quietly to rebuild trust, he chose to fight back publicly. The video appeared on Convergence's Instagram account on Thursday morning. A 5-minute statement filmed in the empty restaurant, with Steve standing behind the chef's counter in his pristine white coat, addressing the camera with barely controlled anger. "What happened last Friday was the result of a malicious vendetta," he declared, his voice rising as he spoke. "Someone with a personal grudge against me orchestrated this entire situation. This wasn't a random inspection. This was sabotage, pure and simple." I watched the video from my laptop, coffee growing cold as I witnessed Steve's public meltdown in real time. He looked haggard, his usual media polish replaced by the desperate energy of someone watching their life's work disintegrate. "Jealous competitors have been trying to undermine me since day one," he continued, his hands gesturing wildly. "They can't stand to see someone succeed who came up the hard way, who built something from nothing. So they manufacture scandals, they spread lies, they corrupt the very institutions that are supposed to protect honest business owners." The video was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Comments began flooding in immediately, ranging from sympathetic to scathing, but the overwhelming response was disbelief at Steve's refusal to take responsibility for his restaurant's violations. "Dude, you literally ignored supplier warnings," wrote one commenter, attaching a screenshot of Carmen's leaked messages. "How is that sabotage? Playing the victim when you put people's health at risk? Classy," added another. Food bloggers picked apart his claims with forensic precision, pointing out that health inspections were random and regulated, not subject to personal vendettas. The local newspaper's restaurant critic published a scathing editorial about accountability in the food service industry, using Steve's video as an example of how not to handle a crisis. But the final blow came from an unexpected source: the European caviar supplier Steve had been working with. Faced with mounting scrutiny, the distributor released their own statement confirming that they had warned Steve multiple times about import regulations and preservative levels. Email records showed a pattern of Steve dismissing their concerns and insisting on cheaper alternatives that skirted FDA guidelines. Mr. Patterson was informed on multiple occasions that certain preservation methods used in our European facilities do not meet United States import standards, the supplier's statement read. "We provided alternative products that were compliant, but he consistently chose the non-compliant options due to their lower cost and higher profit margins." The statement was the final nail in Steve's credibility coffin. His claims of sabotage and vendetta crumbled under the weight of documented evidence showing his own decision-making had led to the violations. Grace's departure, when it came, was as swift and professional as everything else she'd done. No dramatic confrontation, no public statement, just a quietly updated website that no longer listed Convergence among her firm's clients, and a voicemail message informing Steve that their contract had been terminated. Her absence left a void that Steve seemed incapable of filling. Without Grace's media connections and crisis management expertise, he was left to navigate the scandal alone, and his every move seemed to make things worse. The industry publications began running retrospective pieces about warning signs they claimed to have noticed all along. Food and Wine published an article titled, "When Ambition Outpaces Ethics," using Steve's downfall as a cautionary tale about rapid expansion and corner-cutting in the restaurant industry. Through it all, I remained silent. I didn't post celebratory messages on social media. I didn't give interviews to reporters who reached out after discovering my connection to Steve. I didn't even correct people who assumed I was devastated by my husband's professional collapse. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what I'd lost. My old design clients tentatively reached out to welcome me back with surprising warmth. Projects I'd abandoned years ago to support Steve's dreams were still waiting for me, along with new opportunities I'd never expected. Cooper's card arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the grand opening disaster. A simple white card with health department letterhead, containing just 4 words in his careful handwriting: "Favor returned. Well done." I framed it immediately and placed it next to my laptop, where it serves as a daily reminder that quiet integrity often accomplishes more than grand gestures. Next to it sits my business license renewal form, freshly signed with my own name, not as Steve's wife or business partner, but as Erin Matthews, graphic designer. For the first time in years, No one would be erasing my name from anything I created. 3 months after Cooper's card arrived, I was reorganizing my home office when I found the old photo tucked between design portfolios I hadn't touched in years. Steve and me at the food truck, both of us grinning like idiots, covered in flour and sauce stains, holding up the day's earnings, $63 and change. We looked exhausted and ecstatic and completely in love with the possibility of what we were building together. I stared at that photo for a long time, waiting to feel something. Sadness maybe. Nostalgia for what we'd lost. Instead, I felt oddly grateful, not for the pain or the betrayal, but for the clarity that had emerged from the wreckage. Steve once said I'd embarrass him in front of his real guests. The irony wasn't lost on me now. 4 months after he spoke those words, I'd tortured myself with questions. Was I too quiet at parties? Too plain compared to Grace's polished sophistication? Too ordinary for the elevated world Steve was trying to enter? I'd stand in front of mirrors, cataloging my flaws, wondering how I'd become someone worth hiding. But sitting in my office, surrounded by the evidence of my rebuilt life, client contracts, design sketches, business cards with my name printed in bold letters, I finally understood. Steve hadn't been ashamed of me. He'd been ashamed of himself. I was a reminder of where he'd come from. The borrowed money, the failed pop-ups, the nights when we'd counted quarters to buy groceries while he chased his dreams. Grace represented who he wanted to become: successful, connected, untouchable. I represented who he'd been: struggling, uncertain, human. He tried to erase me because he was trying to erase his own history. Convergence eventually reopened after a month of renovations and what Steve's lawyer euphemistically called comprehensive compliance upgrades. The yellow health department notice came down, replaced by a shiny new permit and a hastily installed surveillance system for the walk-in coolers. But the damage had been done. The first week back, the restaurant served maybe 20 covers a night, a catastrophic number for a place that needed to serve 200 just to break even. The local food bloggers who'd once competed for reservations now treated Convergence like a cautionary tale, if they mentioned it at all. Reviews when they came were brutal in their politeness. While the technical execution shows improvement, wrote the city's most influential food critic, it's difficult to taste anything beyond the lingering aftertaste of poor judgment. The lifestyle magazine that had planned a feature spread published instead a brief mention in their Second Chances section, the restaurant equivalent of being damned with faint praise. The nicknames stuck with devastating efficiency: the place that poisoned influencers. Food delivery drivers would make jokes about hazmat suits when picking up orders. Local comedians worked Convergence into their sets. A popular food podcast did an entire episode called Caviar Gate, a study in how not to launch a restaurant. Steve tried everything to rebuild his reputation. He hired a new PR firm, not as prestigious as Grace's, but hungry enough to take on a damaged client. He offered free tastings to food bloggers. He partnered with local charities, donating meals to homeless shelters in carefully orchestrated photo opportunities. Nothing worked. The rebrand attempt was perhaps the most desperate move. 6 months after the reopening, Convergence quietly became the Phoenix, a name so heavy-handed in its symbolism that local food writers mocked it mercilessly. New menus, new color scheme, new everything except the fundamental problem. No one trusted Steve Patterson anymore. Through all of this, I maintained my silence. No vindictive social media posts. No tell-all interviews with the journalists who occasionally reached out. No dramatic confrontations when Steve would come home late, reeking of failure and expensive cologne that couldn't mask his desperation. The absence of drama was its own kind of victory. Steve seemed to expect me to gloat, to throw his cruel words back in his face, to claim credit for his downfall. Instead, I gave him something far more unsettling: indifference. I was polite when we passed in the hallway. I made coffee for 2 in the morning without comment. I continued to share our bed while building a life that had nothing to do with him. That silence was more devastating than any accusation could have been, because it forced Steve to live with the truth every single day, that I had helped build everything he'd achieved, and in trying to erase me, he'd erased himself. My design business flourished with a speed that surprised even me. Word spread through the creative community that Aaron Matthews was available again, and projects materialized faster than I could handle them. A local nonprofit needed a complete brand overhaul. A boutique hotel wanted custom signage. A startup tech company hired me to design their entire visual identity. For the first time in a decade, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. The real transformation began when I started hosting small gatherings in our living room, art-focused events I called Canvas and Conversation. The first one was almost accidental. Sarah, a photographer I'd met through a client project, had mentioned feeling isolated as a creative professional. On impulse, I invited her over for wine and painting on a Thursday evening. She brought her friend Maya, a jewelry designer going through a difficult divorce. Maya brought her neighbor Elena, a writer struggling to finish her first novel. By the third Thursday, I had 8 women crowded around my dining room table, painting watercolor abstracts and sharing stories that ranged from hilarious to heartbreaking. These weren't networking events or business meetings. They were something more valuable. A space where women could exist as themselves, not as extensions of their jobs or relationships or social expectations. We were teachers and entrepreneurs and mothers and artists, but for 3 hours every week we were just ourselves. I haven't painted since high school, Elena confessed during our 4th gathering, holding up a canvas covered in bold strokes of purple and gold. I forgot how good it feels to create something that doesn't have to be perfect. That's the point, I replied, mixing colors on my palette. We spend so much time trying to be what other people need us to be. Sometimes we forget who we are when no one's watching. The gatherings grew organically. Women brought friends who brought sisters who brought colleagues. We moved from my dining room to my garage, then to a rented space in the arts district. What had started as an impulse became a small movement. A place where creativity and community intersected without judgment or competition. I was no longer Steve Patterson's wife or even Erin Patterson, the woman who'd sacrificed her career for someone else's dreams. I was simply Erin, designer, facilitator, friend. The name on my business cards matched the name on my art supplies, and both belonged entirely to me. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier who seemed embarrassed to be there. Steve had filed quietly, probably hoping to avoid any additional media attention. The grounds were irreconcilable differences, which struck me as hilariously inadequate given everything that had happened. I signed them without hesitation. Last week I was at the farmer's market when I noticed a specialty food vendor offering caviar tastings. A small crowd had gathered around his booth, sampling different varieties while he explained the nuances of preparation and sourcing. This one's from a certified sustainable farm in California, he was saying, spooning tiny black pearls onto mother-of-pearl spoons. No preservatives, no additives, just pure flavor. I accepted the sample he offered, letting the caviar dissolve on my tongue. It was clean, briny, perfect. Nothing like the adulterated product that had destroyed Steve's reputation. As I walked away, I found myself smiling. Some dishes I thought are definitely better spoiled. And sometimes the quietest woman in the room, the one everyone overlooks, the one deemed unworthy of inclusion, she's the one who gets to serve the final course. She's the one who decides how the story ends. The Phoenix closed permanently last month. Steve moved to another city, chasing a fresh start in a place where his name didn't carry the weight of scandal. I stayed exactly where I belonged, in the life I'd built from the ashes of the one he'd tried to erase. If this story of quiet revenge had you cheering for Erin, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Cooper stepped into that dining room with his clipboard, knowing exactly what he was about to unleash. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.